So we're on part 2 of the chapter 16 psychology disorders, so psychological disorders, with the AP 8th edition psychology textbook by David Myers. So now we're going to look at dissociative disorders. So dissociative disorders means that your conscious is separate from your body, like there's a separate consciousness that's there. So conscious awareness becomes separated, dissociated from previous memories, thoughts, and feelings. So when we look here, we're looking at symptoms, having a sense of being unreal. This is normally what people who are suffering from a dissociative disorder think. It's like they know that they're real, but they have this feeling that they're not there. They feel like they're being separated from their bodies as well, so it's like a separate body thing. And they watch themselves sometimes like almost like they're in a movie. So they see themselves moving around and going. So the most famous of the dissociative disorders is dissociative identity disorder, DID. It was once called multiple personality disorder. However, we don't like that term anymore. What it's really more of is that the consciousness has split from its awareness and has formed a separate, distinct identity. And so this disorder is highly controversial. And it's highly controversial because it only exists in America. It doesn't seem like this disorder is everywhere. It's like schizophrenia and depression are. What we see is that there's two personalities that have developed, two or more. I mean, some people have more than one or more than two distinct identities. Now, these distinct identities do not know that the other actually exists. They don't talk to each other or anything like that until there's actually some sort of awareness that the consciousness is split and now it's like trying to glue itself back together. And it's normally through like a psychological observation, a therapy session. So it is really controversial. Sometimes the AP psych exam will ask you the difference between like DID and schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is different. That's where like their attention's all over the place. They may see or hear things that don't exist. DID, they believe that they are someone that they are not, and it's distinct. So when we look at critics of DID, critics argue that the diagnosis of DID has increased in the late 20th century. A lot of times, you know, like you see this in movies, and you sometimes see DID and schizophrenia in movies wrong. They'll put somebody as schizophrenic when they really have DID. If someone has a distinct alternate personality, then that would be someone who has DID. Schizophrenia, they don't have another personality. They just have voices telling them to do things. And DID is not found in other countries. Some people believe that these people are simply role-playing to a therapist's suggestion. And you'll actually find plenty of stuff like ABC and 60 Minutes. They've actually found people who were diagnosed DID and now believe that they never had DID, but it was actually a misdiagnosis. And there's learned response that reinforces reduction in anxiety. So there's other disorders that I need to talk about with dissociative that I don't have here. Dissociative figure is when someone believes, like someone forgets who they are and they move away and they form a whole new identity. And it's not because like the mob or anything is after them. What it is that they just, like they wander away from their home and they form this new identity. And they don't remember their old identity. Another dissociative disorder that you need to know is dissociative amnesia. And dissociative amnesia is where a person forgets, they don't have their memories. And there's, you know, it's not really they forget all of it. It's normally like they forget from a source. So there's source amnesia. And that just means they forget from a certain point. Total amnesia is pretty rare, but it's a dissociative disorder. So now that we're going to look at mood disorders, and mood disorders would be like bipolar disorder and major depressive disorder. So when we look at major depressive disorder, it is really, depression is kind of the common cold. A lot of people do suffer from it at some point in their life. And when we look at it a year, 5.8% of men and 9.9% of women actually report being depressed, having actual depression for a while. It needs to be at least 2 weeks or more, and really medicine can help it, so you can do a biomedical therapy, but there are other therapies out there. Biomedical therapy, like when you look at the different pills that are antidepressant pills, they just are on the television nonstop with the commercials. For someone who has major depressive disorder, they have a blue moon. Sometimes they feel like they have a shortness of breath, like they're gaping for breath, they're grasping for it because it's almost like they just had a hard run. When you look at people who actually have major depressive disorder, what you're looking at is, here's some signs, okay? You know, they're fatigued, they're tired all the time, they don't feel like they have any self-worth, they normally lose because they are tired all the time and they don't feel like they're worth anything. They normally lose interest in their families and their friends. They also lose interest in any activities that they would do. So they withdraw from society, they feel worthless, and they're tired all the time. And all these signs, all these symptoms, they actually kind of just increase the depression and make it worse. Dysmanic disorder, what this is just somebody who has like a blue mood. It's not really like you have depression, and it's not necessarily you have a blue mood. You're kind of like in the middle, and this is like daily depression lasting 2 years or more. When we look at bipolar disorder, it was once a long time ago called manic depressive disorder, and this is just alternating like mood between depression and mania, which is like a high period of energy. When you look at depressed symptoms, they're gloomy, they're withdrawn, they have an inability to make decisions, they're tired, and they have a slowness of thought. With the manic symptoms, they normally are elated, they feel like they can do anything, they feel good about themselves, they have euphoria, they have a desire for action, they're up and ready, they're pretty hyperactive, and then they normally have like multiple thoughts going on at the same time. So what ends up happening for them is they have the high and the low. The low is the depression, and the high would be the manic episodes. In a depressed symptom, sometimes these people will try and commit suicide. It's really high for people who have bipolar disorder to at some point try and commit suicide if they're not on some sort of medication or in some sort of therapy. In the mania episode, they believe that they can do anything. They will go days, weeks with little to no sleep, and they seem to keep going. It's like the adrenaline is just pumping throughout their body. And then what happens is after they've been on a huge manic episode for a while, I mean, some people are on manic episodes for 3 years. What happens is they'll fall into the depression. They can go all the way down. They can drop all the way back into a depressed state. And that's when it's the most dangerous, because that is a time when they contemplate suicide or they actually commit suicide. So when you look at people who actually suffer from bipolar disorder, they tend to be our very creative people, our writers, our poets, our composers. And some of the most famous people in history have actually suffered from bipolar. During the manic phase, creativity is pretty rampant for these people because they have that multiple train of thought. Normally we see people who have bipolar disorder as really creative, artistic people. It seems like the scientists, the mathematicians, they don't seem to have this, but I mean, there's creativity there, but it just seems that the writers, the poets, the composers, the comedians of our world tend to suffer from bipolar disorder. When we look at explaining mood disorders, we kind of look at the fact that there's behavior and cognitive changes, and there are common causes of depression. So we try and treat it the best we can. And so we see gender differences as well. Females at least report being depressed more than males. We look at people being able to actually terminate their own depressed episodes. People who have depression is the most common, but it's also the one that people seek help for the most. But sometimes, life changes, your environment changes, and your depressed mood is over, so it just self-terminates. Depression is increasing, especially in our teens, and a lot of it has to do with like that whole self-esteem and bullying. And so we see depression actually increasing in our teenage population, which is why the suicide among teens is scary, just because of the bullying and everything that goes on. Postpartum depression is after a female has given birth, her hormones are all out of whack, and some psychologists have come up with this theory called postpartum depression. And postpartum depression is just like your body has to go back and regulate its hormones again after you had a baby. When we look at suicide, we look at some things being different. There's national differences. There's differences between countries in suicide. There are racial differences in suicide. We do have gender differences. Males actually commit suicide at a higher rate than females. Females will attempt it more than males. Now the difference between this is that males take a more violent, crucial approach to committing suicide. They use guns, they drive their cars off the cliff, whereas females will do things like take pills, and normally when you take too many pills you'll throw it up, and so there's a difference in the way they try and commit suicide. So females take a less violent approach, and men normally take a more violent approach. There's age differences too in suicide. You can see that as people get older, the suicide rate is going to get a little bit higher, but some of that is because there's assisted suicide, also medical conditions, and being alone, maybe because your partner has passed away, that also contributes to it. So when we look at the biological perspective, mood disorders run in families. We typically see, like, if your grandmother or your mother suffers from depression, it normally means that you have a predisposition to also suffer from a depression. So linkage analysis and association studies link possible genes and dispositions for depression. When we look at neurotransmitters in depression, we see that they don't have enough norepinephrine and serotonin. And so norepinephrine has to deal with adrenaline. So epinephrine is adrenaline. So norepinephrine is non-adrenaline. They don't have enough of that and serotonin, which regulates your mood. And because of these things, it contributes to them having a mood disorder. So what the pills, what the biomedical therapy does is it tries to increase these levels in a person. So drugs that act that alleviate mania reduce norepinephrine. So it tries to get their adrenaline down. So when we look at the depressed brain, the PET scans, they show that brain energy consumption rises and falls with manic and depressive episodes. So if you look at the depressed brain, it's pretty low activity. Then during the manic episode, look at all that brain energy that's going on. And then the next week, you see this depressed brain again, and you see less activity than previously. So the social cognitive perspective. Sometimes we look at people who have depression or suffer from it as having a self-defeating belief. They don't believe that they can do anything good, and so they always talk themselves down. And sometimes they are a pessimistic, or they have a negative explaining style to their life. So they explain things in a negative way. They see the glass as half empty. We look at depressed cycles. What happens is there's negative stressful events. They have that pessimistic way of explaining everything. They feel hopeless. And all these things, it stops you from feeling good about yourself and thinking and acting in positive ways. And that just fuels personal rejection. Because if you don't feel good about yourself and that's what you're projecting to the world, most people don't think that you matter as well. So when you look at examples between the way people explain things, a stable person versus someone who might not be as stable. So the stable person, I'll get over this, without my partner, I can't seem to do anything right. Internal, our breakup was all my fault. And then you go into the depression. Now, the temporary person who sees this as a temporary breakup, you look at this as something that, it's hard to take, but I'm going to get over it. It's like a temporary setback. And then you look at something specific, I miss my partner, but thankfully, I got my family, I got my friends with me, and external. It takes two to make a relationship work, and it wasn't meant to be. So there's a difference between, like, the stable person kind of sees things as this is a temporary setback in my life, and the unstable person kind of sees this as something that's stable, that will always be in their life. So next we're going to look at schizophrenia, and schizophrenia is very, very rare, and you're only looking at 1 in 100 people actually suffering from schizophrenia, and only 24 million people suffer from this disease. So schizophrenia strikes young people as they mature into adults. So normally you start seeing the symptoms in their young teenage years. It affects men and women equally, so men and women are both affected by it. Men suffer, though, however, from it more severely than women do. So when we look at schizophrenia, it literally means split mind, but that is not a correct diagnosis of what happens. What you're seeing is that people who suffer from schizophrenia have disorganized and delusional thinking, so they're real scattered, their speech might be real broken up, and they might see or hear things that don't really exist. That would be that delusions. Sometimes they have disturbed perceptions, and then they have the inappropriate emotions and actions, so they might laugh at a funeral or something like that. So here's the disorganized and delusional thinking. This morning when I was at Hillside, he means Hillside Hospital, I was making a movie. I was surrounded by movie stars. I'm Mary Poppins. Is this room painted blue to get me upset? My grandmother died 4 weeks after my 18th birthday. Those are like whole different topics for every single sentence there. And so this is very much the disfragmented speech pattern that they come out with, and the distorted beliefs of, like, I'm Mary Poppins. That's the delusion. So we do see some other forms of delusions, like sometimes people believe that they are being persecuted, that someone's following them, but we also see delusions of grandeur, and delusions of grandeur, like I'm the king, I'm going to be the president of the United States, and I mean, it's not going to happen, but that's what ends up happening for some of the people who suffer from schizophrenia. What we notice about schizophrenics is that they have a pretty selective attention, and the selective attention can be on the bizarre and the fragmented things that are going on in the room. It's like they focus in on whatever they want, and they can't stop focusing on it, and it's not because they don't want to stop focusing on it, they just can't. And disturbed perception. So a schizophrenic person, they may perceive things that are not there, the hallucinations. So they may see things,